The morning sun broke over the fields of Maple Creek, coating the wheat in a soft, golden hue. A rusty old truck rolled down a dirt road, its paint faded and tires tired from years of hauling burdens no one else could see. Behind the wheel sat Luke Halstead. 37, a weathered farmer with kind eyes, rough hands, and the kind of posture that comes from too many seasons bent to the earth. In the passenger seat, his 7-year-old daughter. Ellie bounced her knees, humming to herself, a worn, plush bunny clutched in her arms. Luke had raised her alone since Ellie's mother passed during childbirth. The farm, once thriving, had fallen into debt and disrepair. But Luke never let Ellie feel it. He packed her lunch with stories instead of sweets, patched her shoes with love instead of leather. She was his reason to keep going, even when he wanted to quit. But that morning, something was off. Ellie's humming slowed. Her head leaned against the window. By the time they reached the roadside market, her hands were trembling, her skin pale. Luke touched her forehead, burning. Within an hour, Luke was speeding toward the nearest hospital, 40 miles away. The old truck wheezed, struggling against the highway wind. Luke kept one hand on the wheel and the other on Ellie's knee, whispering prayers that blurred with tears. The ER at Fairview General was packed. Flu season, sirens, coughing. A man cried into his hands in the corner. A nurse rushed past with a crash cart. Luke held Ellie in his arms like a cradle, standing at the front desk. "She's burning up," he said. "She's barely breathing." The nurse nodded, called a code. Within seconds, Ellie was wheeled away through swinging double doors and Luke was left standing in silence, her plush bunny dangling from his hand. Hours passed. He sat alone in the waiting room, staring at the floor tiles. No insurance, no savings. He'd sold his last harvest at a loss. When the doctor finally came out, he spoke gently, but the words fell like stone. "Infection in the blood. It's bad. We need to act fast." Luke asked what it would cost. The doctor hesitated before answering. Luke buried his face in his hands. He hadn't cried in years, but now he broke, right there on the ER bench surrounded by strangers. His body shook with sobs too long held back. He whispered to himself over and over, "Please, please don't take her too." And then, a soft voice beside him. A woman had taken the seat next to him without a sound. She looked barely 30, far too young to wear the kind of grief etched in her eyes. But there it was, elegance wrapped in silence, sorrow masked by grace. Her blazer was tailored, her heels quiet on the floor. And when she leaned closer, the air around her seemed to still. She didn't ask his name. She didn't tell him hers. She simply leaned in and whispered 4 words that would change everything. Luke slowly lifted his face from his hands, blinking through tears. The ER noise faded into a dull blur. Time had lost its grip. Somewhere in the back hallway, a machine beeped. An orderly wheeled an empty gurney past, but right beside him, the world seemed to hush into stillness. A woman sat beside him. He hadn't even noticed her arrive. She looked barely 30, too young to have eyes that carried so much sorrow. She was dressed with quiet elegance, charcoal gray blazer, pressed trousers, hair tied back in a low bun. But it wasn't the wealth she radiated that struck Luke. It was the silence she wore, like someone who had seen pain and learned to carry it without noise. She didn't fidget, didn't scroll her phone, just sat there, her hands folded gently in her lap, her gaze focused somewhere past the buzzing lights. And then she turned to him. Her voice was soft, low, and deliberate. "Let me help you." 4 words, that's all. Luke blinked at her, stunned. Surely he'd misheard. No one ever said things like that to men like him. Not without strings, not in sterile ER corridors, not when his daughter was clinging to life and he had nothing left to offer, not money, not hope, not even a prayer that hadn't already been used up. He tried to form words, failed. managed only a hoarse whisper. "I'm sorry." "What?" She turned fully toward him now, folding one leg over the other, still composed. Her voice never wavered. "I said, let me help you. Your daughter needs care. The hospital's already calling in the pediatric ICU team. They can stabilize her if they move fast." Luke looked down at his rough hands. Dirt still lined his fingernails from the morning's failed irrigation repair. "You don't even know us." "You're a father," she said. "She's your world. That's enough for me." He stared at her. Her tone wasn't pitying. It wasn't condescending. It was reverent, like she understood the weight of love that bends a man's back and breaks his pride. Still, his voice cracked. "I can't accept charity. I didn't come here for handouts." She nodded slowly, like she expected that response. "It's not charity," she said. "It's repayment, for something I can never return." Luke's brow furrowed, confused. She stood gracefully, walked toward the check-in window and reached into her bag. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, elegant but purposeful. From her purse, she drew a sleek black card and handed it to the receptionist. Nurses perked up. Someone whispered her name. One of the administrators came rushing out to greet her with the nervous energy reserved for VIPs. Luke watched all of it in disbelief. She wasn't just any woman. This was someone important, powerful. She signed forms, spoke in hushed tones, then returned to him and placed a clipboard on the seat between them. Her expression was calm, but her voice carried a rare gentleness. "I've covered the cost. She's being admitted. They'll start her treatment within the hour." Luke opened his mouth, but the words tangled inside. "Why?" he finally managed. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" She looked away briefly, toward the hallway where the ICU doors had just swung shut behind Ellie's gurney. "Because once, when I was younger, someone saved me," she whispered, "and I never got the chance to say thank you. Maybe helping you is the closest I'll ever get." Luke searched her face for an answer, something that explained why this graceful stranger had chosen him, why his little girl mattered to someone like her. He didn't know her name, not yet, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning. The hallway outside the pediatric ICU was quiet now. Luke sat in a small waiting area, knees jittering, fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. The room was dim, lit by the evening sun stretching shadows across the tiled floor. The distant rhythm of monitors and the occasional cough were the only reminders that life still pulsed in this sterile place. He couldn't sit still. He stood, paced a few feet, sat again. His mind played a loop of everything the doctors had said. Ellie was stable, but fragile. The infection had spread quickly, and they were working fast to contain it. Margaret's intervention had bought time, but it was still a race. And Luke, he was powerless now, watching strangers battle for his daughter's life. He didn't notice Margaret walk in until she set 2 paper cups of coffee on the table beside him. He looked up. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him again, her presence grounding in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Luke reached for one of the cups. His fingers trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, then glanced toward the hallway. "They said she's brave." He smiled faintly. "She always has been. Braver than me, that's for sure." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Then Margaret spoke. "You don't have to tell me your story, but if you ever want to, I'll listen." Luke let the offer settle before answering. His voice was low, edged with weariness. "I used to have a little farm in Harmony Ridge just outside town. My wife Lila, she ran it with me. We weren't rich, but it was ours. Then she got sick. It happened so fast." He paused, his throat tightened. "She passed last winter. I've been trying to keep things going since, but between the drought and the bank and Ellie getting sick," he trailed off. "Some days, I feel like I'm just patching holes in a ship that's already underwater." Margaret didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes soft but attentive. Luke gave a bitter chuckle. "I didn't expect anyone like you to be here tonight." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Anyone like me?" "You're clearly not from my world," he said, motioning vaguely at her designer coat, the watch peeking from her sleeve. "You belong in glass towers, not waiting rooms." She gave a small smile, quiet, a little sad. "I used to think that too." Luke tilted his head. Margaret looked out the window. "I was married once. His name was Daniel. He ran a tech firm. We lived fast, parties, travel, jetting to 3 countries in a week. Then one day, his plane didn't come back." Luke fell silent. "I thought I'd die with him," she whispered, "but I didn't. I just froze. For 3 years. No purpose, no connection, just wealth and silence." Her fingers curled around the coffee cup. "And then one day, I saw a story. A farmer, just like you, built a greenhouse from salvaged parts to grow food for a whole community during lockdown. He didn't have much, but he gave what he could. That story brought me back. It reminded me the world still had heart, that maybe I could still be part of it." Luke looked at her surprised. "You saved me once," she said, meeting his gaze, without knowing it. Their eyes locked for a long moment. In that waiting room, something shifted. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. 2 broken people finding echoes of themselves in someone else. The next morning brought rain. Not the harsh kind that flattens crops, but a gentle whispering drizzle that seemed to soften everything it touched. Luke stood outside the hospital's glass doors, breathing in the scent of wet asphalt. His boots were soaked, but he didn't move. Inside, Ellie was still sleeping, breathing easier now. The fever had broken sometime during the night. Margaret had stayed too, not hovering, just present, like a sturdy oak beside a battered fence. He didn't know what she was. An angel, maybe? Or a ghost of someone better. Either way, her presence felt like the first real light in months. By afternoon, a nurse called him in. Ellie had asked for him. He stepped into her room and felt tears sting his eyes. Her cheeks were pink again. Her eyelids fluttered as she blinked up at him, and her tiny hand reached for his the moment she saw him. "Hi, Daddy." He sat beside her and kissed her knuckles. "Hey, Peanut, you scared me." "I had a weird dream," she murmured. "You were building a garden on the moon." He chuckled, and for the first time in what felt like years, it was real. Margaret appeared at the door a few minutes later, hesitant. Luke waved her in. Ellie blinked up at the woman with innocent curiosity. "Who's that?" Luke hesitated, then said softly, "She's our friend." Margaret smiled and stepped closer. "Hi, Ellie, I brought something for you." From her bag, she pulled out a small stuffed rabbit, white with velvet ears and a patch over one eye. Ellie grinned. "He looks like Bunny's brother." "That's what I thought," Margaret said gently. They stayed together in that room for a long time. Ellie dozed off again. Margaret stepped out to give them space, but Luke followed her. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You already have," she replied, but something tugged at him. He couldn't let this end in a hospital corridor. She had walked into his life like rain after drought, and if she disappeared now, he'd never forgive himself for staying silent. "I have something," he said suddenly. "Back home, on the farm, a greenhouse. Well, it used to be. Now it's mostly just broken glass and overgrown vines. Lila, my wife, used to grow things there. Maybe it sounds stupid, but I've been trying to rebuild it. For Ellie, for something to come back to." Margaret tilted her head. "Why are you telling me this?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because I want you to see it." She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. The rain had slowed. Then she nodded. "All right." 3 days later, when Ellie was cleared to go home, Luke drove the old truck through winding hills back toward Harmony Ridge. Margaret followed in her sleek black sedan, out of place on the muddy back roads. When they pulled into the gravel drive, the farmhouse looked smaller than he remembered, its white paint chipped, the barn roof sagging. But the greenhouse stood in the distance, fragile, ghostly, waiting. He led her through the tall grass, past the chicken coop, past the silent scarecrow, and into the greenhouse. It was a mess, cracked glass, vines swallowing everything. But in one corner, a single sunflower stood, tall, golden, refusing to wilt. He knelt beside it. "I didn't plant that. It just showed up one day." Margaret walked to it and ran a finger along a broken pot nearby. "I think you've got more growing here than you think," she said. The first night back on the farm was quiet. Too quiet. Luke had forgotten how silence could be both a comfort and a weight. Ellie was sleeping soundly in her old room, curled beside her newly gifted rabbit, her chest rising and falling like a soft tide. Luke sat outside on the porch, a coffee mug resting between his palms. The stars above were so clear, it felt like you could reach up and borrow one. But all he could do was stare at the barn, at the faint silhouette of the greenhouse behind it, thinking of what used to be, and what might still be. Margaret hadn't left. Her car was still parked near the front gate, though she hadn't said where she'd go next. She didn't seem to know, and he didn't want to ask. The screen door creaked softly. She stepped outside, wrapping a cardigan tighter around her. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid. She looked less like a billionaire and more like someone who belonged here, among stars and silence and aching pasts. "You okay?" she asked. Luke nodded slowly. "It's strange, having her back in this house again. I thought I'd feel peace, but it's more like I'm afraid it'll all slip away again." Margaret leaned against the porch rail. "You're allowed to be scared. Loving something after losing it once, that takes more courage than most people have." He turned toward her. "You always speak like someone who's already lived 2 lives." "I have," she said quietly. "The first ended when I buried Daniel. The second started, maybe when I sat beside you in that hospital." They were quiet for a while. Then Luke said, "I want to fix the greenhouse." Margaret glanced at him. "You mean really fix it?" He nodded. "Not just for Ellie, for Lila, for myself, maybe, for something that still grows." She smiled. "Then let's do it." The next morning began with old gloves, rusty tools, and work boots sunk into muddy ground. Luke pulled out broken glass with bare hands. Margaret surprised him. She wasn't afraid to get dirty. She rolled up her sleeves, tied back her braid, and cleared vine roots like she'd done it all her life. By noon, Ellie wandered out with Bunny 2 tucked under her arm, watching them work. "Is this where Mommy used to grow tomatoes?" she asked, standing in the arch of the greenhouse door. Luke swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, peanut, and strawberries, and sunflowers too. Are we going to make it pretty again?" "We are," Margaret said before Luke could answer. "We're going to make it even better." And they did. Over the next few days, the 3 of them worked side by side. Luke showed Ellie how to press seeds into the soil. Margaret drew out plans for a water system. Neighbors stopped by when they saw the activity. Some brought tools, others brought food. Everyone stayed longer than they planned. The farm that had been slowly dying came back to life, not because of money, but because of hands, and effort, and heart. Luke found himself waking before the sun again, but this time not to dread. He had something to build, something to grow, something to protect. And in the quiet moments, those just before sunrise or while watering the newly planted rows, he'd glance across the yard and see Margaret, always close, always calm. He wondered if she knew what she was becoming to them, to him. One night, after Ellie had gone to bed, he walked her to her car. "You don't have to keep staying," he said. I mean, I won't stop you, but I wouldn't blame you if you went back to the world you came from." Margaret paused beside her open door, then looked at him squarely. "I don't think I belong in that world anymore," she said. To him. One night after Ellie had gone to bed, he walked her to her car. "You don't have to keep staying," he said. "I mean, I won't stop you, but I wouldn't blame you if you went back to the world you came from." Margaret paused beside her open door, then looked at him squarely. "I don't think I belong in that world anymore," she said. And for the first time, Luke allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his world was enough. The greenhouse stood complete by spring. Glass panes now gleamed in the morning sun, clean and whole again. Inside, green things stretched and swayed in the breeze that slipped through half-open windows. Tomatoes, beans, lavender, even a patch of wild strawberries, all taking root beneath warm light and patient hands. It hadn't just become a garden. It had become a place where stories were retold and new ones were born. Luke stepped inside one crisp morning, wiping sweat from his brow. Ellie trailed behind him, carrying a watering can nearly half her size, humming a made-up tune. Margaret was already there, kneeling near the back rows, whispering to a row of tiny basil sprouts like they were old friends. Ellie ran to her. "Miss Margaret, look, my sunflower's taller than me now." Margaret stood and turned, brushing her palms on her jeans. She looked down at the girl, then up at the crooked stalk behind her. "I think it's trying to catch the sky." Luke watched the exchange with quiet awe. The two of them had formed something unspoken, a trust that never had to be asked for. It just existed, the way sunlight exists without needing permission. But something had changed in him too. He'd stopped waiting for the world to fall apart. He'd stopped measuring his days in what he'd lost, and slowly he began to measure them by what he still had. By the way, Ellie laughed again. By the way, Margaret looked at him across fresh soil. Later that afternoon, as they all sat under the old oak tree with lemonade in hand, Ellie napped in the grass. The breeze was light, full of the scent of new leaves and distant rain. Luke turned to Margaret. "You never told me what you whispered that night," he said. She looked puzzled. "What night?" "In the ER," he said, "when Ellie was fading. You sat beside me and said something. I never asked, but I think about it more than I should." Margaret grew quiet. Then her gaze softened and she spoke. "I said, 'You're not alone anymore.'" The words landed like soft rain on dry earth. Luke didn't speak for a while. He looked at Ellie, at the farm, at the house that was no longer hollow, then back to her. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything." Margaret reached across and touched his hand, fingers warm against his calloused skin. "I didn't save you," she said gently. "You saved me too." Months passed. The greenhouse became more than a garden. It became a community spot, a place where neighbors came for fresh herbs or just to sit in the quiet with tea and memories. People donated tools. Kids came to learn how to grow things. One morning, Luke found Margaret standing in the middle of the greenhouse, staring at the sunflower. She turned, hesitant. "There's something I should ask," she said. He waited. "I used to think my story ended when I buried Daniel. But now, I wonder, could there be a second chapter? One with roots, with sunshine, with muddy boots and burnt coffee and maybe even love?" Luke took a breath that reached all the way into his chest. "Margaret," he said, stepping closer, "I think we've already started writing that chapter." He kissed her. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was more than enough.